thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. Giving everybody an opportunity to, oh wow, that was a lot louder. I was using my non-microphone voice, and now I'll have to revert to quiet inside voice. Everybody, thanks very much for joining us at this great and unique event. As an Atlantic Council member, I'm always honored to have an opportunity to moderate an interesting panel, especially one as interesting as this on what's a critical topic. I mean, in Washington, there's always plenty of stuff on the policy debate and what happens with Mideast peace and energy and stuff like that, but very little devoted to the defense industrial rise of two countries that are trying to translate their oil reserves or oil revenues into what they see as sort of a longer-term shift in their economies, and both also to use them as propellers of the economy. Two nations that are increasingly, that are obviously energy players, but increasingly national security players, that also constitute, a $2 trillion weapons and security market over the next 10 years for the companies in this room and in this town and in capitals around the world at a time when domestic spending is dropping. So the drive for sort of Arab defense self-sufficiency, is nothing new. It's, Bilal, notes in his paper that 1975 was, an initiative underway in the wake of the '73 war in order to try to gain that degree of independence. But it was ended up being somewhat less than perhaps successful than originally envisioned at the end of the day. But over the decades, that doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia and the UAE haven't been moving up the food chain. I remember, now going back many years ago, asking Prince Bandar whether or not Saudis had any problems, flying airplanes that had Israeli parts on them, and he said, not as long as the Israelis don't have problems flying planes with Saudi parts on them. And since then, both of countries have dramatically stepped up their investment. I mean, once upon a time, IDEX was a sleepy show, where I'm only somewhat joking, where you could buy bags of ammunition from people if you wanted it. To something that is far glitzier and has a number of very local names, Mubadala and Tawazun and other companies that are standing up and trying to be forces within that market. And that, of course, over time is also going to create challenges, both opportunities but also challenges with that greater independence. Countries that are looking at taking a different strategic or tactical path will have certain opportunities that they may not have now. One of the other reasons I have to say I really enjoyed Bilal's report was that it is a broad survey. I mean, it's not dedicated exclusively to the defense industrial base, but also covers societal trends, cultural trends, education, investment patterns, which I think makes it interesting, particularly interesting. And so with that, I think everybody's got the introductions, so our two panelists deserve no introduction, I think. And so by that right, Bilal, why don't you take it off? Everybody's going to spend about 15 minutes talking about their views. I will not say anything, but will be in my role as moderator. I'm going to ask a couple of questions of both Mary Beth and Bilal to get the conversation started, and we'll open it up to you guys to take it away at that point. Bilal?
Let me first thank you both for coming and everybody for being here. Eric Gaiman and Nona Gorilovskaya, I want to thank you also for editing this beast. Mari, Morgan, thank you for organizing this. I think this kind of analysis is long overdue, and it just so happens that I wrote it. I think it's a story worth telling, and it should have been covered some time ago. You get bits and pieces of news about it. IDEX, shipbuilding in the UAE, armored vehicle production in Saudi Arabia, Emirati companies selling ammunition in Knoxville, Tennessee. Both the Saudis and the Emiratis are producing drones. The Emiratis are exporting the military vehicles. Algeria and Jordan. Maintenance, repair, overhaul is booming in both countries, especially in the aerospace sector. Defense spending is just nuts. The Saudis spend the most in the region. They're number 7 globally. The UAE is the 4th largest arms importer in the world. They're a regional leader in command and control of air power. And they have a frontier defense hub that actually exports some military items across the world, and not just at IDEX. So again, why aren't we talking more about this? in the Gulf, and specifically in these two countries, which I consider the defense heavyweights in the region, in addition to the Israelis, of course. Now, I'm less interested in the details, even though I find them fascinating. What I wanted to do in this report, and Vago is right on point with that, is that I wanted to take a look at the big picture. And I wanted to tell the story of why this is important and what it actually means at the end of the day, not just for the two countries, but for the region as a whole, and importantly for the United States. Other countries have tried before in the region to do this. Since the very formation of the Arab state system in the mid-20th century, the Egyptians tried very hard, but they ultimately failed because they didn't have enough money and they didn't have enough resources and expertise. They tried to, as Vago said, rally around them the Arabs in a collective effort after successive defeats in wars with the Israelis, but that didn't go very far. The Gulf countries have been spending a lot of money on this, and I think it's about time to take a look at what they have been doing, specifically these two countries, over the past, I'd say, decade, not to be very specific. So why are they doing this? I mean, let me just go over very quickly some of the motivations, and frankly, they're not that dissimilar from what other developing countries' motivations are, whether it's in Latin America or in Asia. I think the primary reason, it tends to be the most dominant one, is just national security. Great, you have an excellent relationship with the United States when it comes to defense and security, but last time I checked, there's no defense pact between the United States and these two countries, and there's just simply no substitute for indigenous defense capabilities, no matter how strong the U.S. Gulf Partnership is. So national security is a very important reason. They perceive a number of domestic and external threats. They want to address them, perhaps not today with their own capabilities, but down the road, that could be an increasing possibility. Another major reason I see is economic diversification, and they're pretty serious about that. They're actually confident, perhaps more the Emiratis than the Saudis. They're confident that they will be able to achieve that vision sometime within the next 20 years or so, which is why they're very serious about coming up with long-term documents and strategy visions where they see themselves achieving economic diversification. A lot of you would be obviously skeptical because of it's so easy right now with the massive oil revenues, but some people, some smart people in those two countries are looking a little bit ahead down the road and seeing that this is just not sustainable. Maybe military industrialization could be another engine towards economic diversification. Let's just not forget prestige. It's not really a small variable in this equation. Prestige is not limited to the Middle East or these two countries, but it's a strong factor, let's just say. Well, it's not just in arms production for these two countries, but in arms acquisition and what kind of stuff they buy from the United States. My colleague Tony Kortzman calls it the glitter factor, which means that the Arabs and these two countries tend to emphasize more size and modernity in their acquisitions, less so effectiveness and systems integration. I think he has a point. Other reasons I think are less important than these two, so I'll just limit it to that. I think they also obviously have a very strong interest in limiting their dependence on the United States. It just goes without saying that both countries are simply fed up with the export controls in Washington, and I suspect that they're still not happy with the reforms enacted by President Obama on that particular issue. It's still very laborious. It's still very slow, and there's still massive concerns in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh regarding that entire process. Would they be able to achieve the independence? Not really. Nobody's really talking about self-sufficiency here. But every country, aspiring country, a rising country, has an obligation to at least try to reduce, it's all relative at the end of the day, to reduce its dependence on outside powers and even the best friends, whether it's the United States or anybody else. So I think those are the strongest motivations. Others you'll just find in the report, but I find them less important. So what are we talking about here? What exactly are they doing, and where are they succeeding or where are they failing? It's still a limited effort at the end of the day. And like I said, self-sufficiency is nowhere near possible. But in some limited sectors, whether it's in ammunition, whether it's in MRO, whether it's in adaptation of certain technology that they would import and adapt into their own needs, they've been doing a good job. And there's steady progress in those fields. Like I mentioned in my introduction, they are actually producing some military items. There's a pretty booming industry of UAVs in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. That's not to say that they're doing it on their own. I'm sure they are getting a lot of assistance from whether it's the South Africans or the Europeans. But at the end of the day, they are producing or co-producing through partnerships, very smart partnerships with the top defense companies. Some of the representatives of those top defense companies are actually here with us today, so they know exactly what I'm talking about. And joint ventures, enduring ones. They played their cards right as far as those partnerships, and I see them only increasing and developing further down the road. What does that mean for the United States? What kind of implications does that have for the United States and the region? This is all great news. I mean, at the end of the day, just look at the 06, 010, 2014 QDRs. Every single one of them emphasizes the strategic interest of the United States to help its partners develop their own local capabilities. Why? Because it's good to have strong partners. It allows you to focus on other regions, shall we say, and perhaps down the road execute your pivot to the Asia Pacific. It's all consistent with the U.S. strategic interest of expanding its partnerships and, like I said, helping its partners develop their own indigenous capabilities. Does that mean that there's no risk whatsoever? Not at all. I think we have to be honest with ourselves and entertain the possibility that should this trend of defense industrialization in the Gulf happen at a much more rapid pace, coupled with political uncertainties between the United States and its two partners and others in the Gulf, I think this is when we start getting a little bit worried about what direction this is heading. And let's also be very frank, and I'm always blunt in my presentations, I think the stronger worry here is what would happen with the Saudi direction, less so than the Emirati one. I think that the Emiratis, and that's the major difference here between these two countries, the Emiratis, sure, they have their strong concerns about U.S. policy towards Iran or Egypt, but the relationship still has been stable and predictable. Not so much between Riyadh and Washington. I think that the concerns are shared, but the way the Saudis have reacted to their massive disappointment with U.S. policy has been quite, I would say, bizarre and public. The row with Washington has really puzzled a lot of analysts. Their rejection of a United Nations Security Council seat was just quite inexplicable. I mean, it hurt them more than anything else. It did send a political message to Washington, but I thought it backfired. Washington has a say over what kind of direction this takes, whether it's in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The partnership between the two is pretty serious, and it's strong, and I think it's enduring. And it still rests on some pretty solid foundations and some really common interests. But should those uncertainties persist down the road, especially between the Saudis and the Americans, and who knows? I mean, let's entertain the unthinkable. An actual strategic rift happens between the Saudis and the Americans. I think this could cause some risks to U.S. security interests. I think this greater independence and capabilities on the part of some partners in the Gulf could just complicate some things for the United States in that part of the world. It could complicate U.S. strategy. It could complicate its relations with other Gulf partners. It would be a headache. And we know that unilateralism on the part of some U.S. friends and partners could undermine some security interests. Just ask Jim Mattis about what the effects of Israeli unilateralism has done in the Palestinian territories in Syria and in Lebanon. It has actually undermined U.S. security interests. The same could happen with the Saudis. God forbid another Gulf War happens tomorrow, 1990, 1991, and the Saudis decide to act on their own outside the confines of the U.S. Gulf Partnership. That could spell trouble for the United States. So we need to closely monitor this trend, but more importantly, keep a close eye on the political relationship, because that's key at the end of the day. Hardware is great, but it's politics that drives the partnership. With that, I can turn it over to Mary Beth.
Great. Thanks very much, Bilal. Mary Beth?
Great. Well, before I dive into just a real quick talk about some of the general points of Bilal and the Atlantic Council's excellent paper, I want to thank Vago for being here and thank Bilal for the invitation, and thank all of you for giving up your precious lunch hours. I want to scratch at two things that Bilal raised in his discussion. When we talk about why the Gulf in general and the Saudis and the UAE in particular have purchased so many defense weapons and capabilities and are interested in developing their own, I think one of the reasons that Bilal did not mention that I think is worth highlighting, and I would put it fairly high up in the list, I won't attempt to prioritize them, and that is to provide both countries, both individually and collectively, with foreign policy and military options. Those who watch either from the policy realm or from the business realm see a very deliberate decision to have various vendors from various different nations, alliances that are based on the desire to be interoperable, to leverage each other's strengths and weaknesses to provide not only the nation, but the Gulf and freedom of navigation in particular. So you have, for example, the Saudi maritime capability being more or less generally divided between U.S. and French equipment and capabilities. You have in the UAE plenty of equipment, of course, and techniques and services provided by U.S., by British, and by French, just to name a few. And I think that provides them not only with choices of partners, but it provides them opportunities, frankly, to have options, both from a foreign policy standpoint. So if you happen to be disagreeing with one of your vendors' national policies or defense strategy, you do have alternatives or redundancies and options, but also security options. Should one vendor one country have a policy against A, you can buy it from vendor or country B. And we'll see that played out and are seeing it played out in a realistic way, I think, in particular in UAVs. I also think one of the whys that probably should have been mentioned and is maybe lower in the list is deterrence. I mean, there's messaging going on there, not only to partners, but to, of course, adversaries. And I don't think I need to go into that. So I think those are important to realize when you look at the reasons why both countries are spending a fair amount and have really, in the last 2 decades, done a significant change. I mean, change that normally takes generations to accomplish. Historically, in other countries, they've done in really less than 2 decades. The other point I just want to scratch at a little bit is the idea of self-sufficiency. I think both countries, while articulating self-sufficiency or the goal of self-sufficiency in certain sectors, will also be very clear about the fact that they do want to be interoperable. They envision themselves as being interoperable, to work together, to leverage their capabilities and those of the partners, whether it's the Brits, the French, or the US, in certain capabilities, and that there are deliberate attempts to align themselves accordingly. So we don't want to overplay the self-sufficiency angle too much, because both from a military capability standpoint, but I think also from an industrial standpoint, there's a lot of decisions that are made with the idea of being true partners, both tactically and strategically. So I wanted to spend the majority of my time talking about a couple of the recommendations and the focal points of the paper, which I thought were really excellent And I would like to add a little bit of flesh to particularly the offsets portion, because I think many in the room are very interested in that. And I also think the undercurrents of education and economic and trade decisions, and also from a vendor standpoint, a business decision, those are all sort of mixed up in an appropriate balance that manifests itself sometimes predominantly in offsets, as opposed to larger policy issues. So the first thing I wanted to just talk about really briefly was the recommendation in the paper that there really needs to be clarity of purpose and a strategy to the defense industrialization of the individual countries. And I think that's true. What I don't think is that I'm clear, and it may be unclear to certainly outsiders, is how the defense industrialization policy fits into the overall military and security strategy. What kind of defense, what kind of offense do we want? And then how that dovetails, if it does, with a trade and economic policy. What kind of industrialization are you focusing on? What are your priorities? What are your end goals for the next decade, et cetera? And I think and those may occur either at the Saudi Arabia Economic Offset Program level, where you have various participants who are knowledgeable about or who give input on the larger policy of the country from a strategic security view and from a trade and economic view, or perhaps with the Tawazun Economic Council participants there. But I'm not clear that those ties are as strong as they might be. And that manifests itself in issues such as, what is the production plan? Where are the enablers, as far as where are the human capital inputs that provide me with the adequately trained managers, engineers, technicians, logistics, supply chain, et cetera, that will support this endeavor from a commercial standpoint, that will support this company so that your goals as far as profitability and your timelines as far as milestones for achievement in a JV are met. How is that based on some kind of analysis of where you want to go at the end of this, and then what is the business case at the end of the day? How do all those link up? And at the end, ultimately, how does that either further your goals, the UAE or KSA, as far as either developing a military capability or an industrial/trade economic capability, as well as capabilities then for your military. And then from a opposite standpoint, from a commercial standpoint, how do I make money and make sure that this isn't a dry hold? How do I end up that I'm getting return on my investment ultimately? How do I recoup investment that either I have made as an industry player or the U.S. government has made in developing the R&D or the program that is going to be modified and or sold to you, and how does that business case manifest itself? And I think the transparency there is difficult, and for many of the businesses as well as the government, it's difficult sometimes to identify the necessary enablers that are going to make this a success, either from an institutional standpoint, a military standpoint, or a business standpoint. And I think that's probably one of the main weaknesses of perhaps a lack of a strategy or an unarticulated strategy that clarity leads to indecisions and perhaps a weakness in the ultimate successes of not only the tasks but the plan at the end. Which brings up questions about what role does the private sector play in the host countries? Are the same human capital and other needs that you would find in the micro sense? This business is failing because I can't find technicians, engineers, and experienced managers. Is that applicable to the macro sense in that there's only a limited number of private sector companies or private sector pools to provide enablers like key input, et cetera? And I think that's probably the case. And the big question is, and what are they doing about it? So that's the one place I think should deserve some fleshing out, because there are implications, both from a policy, general strategic sense, as well as a business sense. The second is the idea of this combined GCC or bilateral strategy as far as defense industrialization. I think it's a wonderful concept. It's a concept that's been floating around for a couple of decades. I also think it's probably premature and a bridge way too far. From my standpoint, and I am only here speaking for myself, if you can't get the individual, either the strategy right, the plan right, or the actual endeavor right, down to the JV level or the industrial level, at the company or the country level, it's awfully difficult to talk about integrating that and coordinating that across nations with very different ideas about how they approach the sector, very different military and defense, not to mention trade and commercial strategies, probably limitations and deficiencies that complicate are similar in each country and get more complicated the more actors that you involve. I'm a pessimist regarding the administration's announced GCC-wide procurement initiative. I think it's a wonderful aspiration. I don't think in the near term that it'll have much impact from a realistic standpoint, when we can talk about that. But that gets us to, offset, which I promised I would talk about very briefly, and I'm sure I'm running up against time. I think from an offset perspective, the strides that have been made in a very short period of time, if you just remember briefly, the Emirates in particular have only really been a nation or unified entity for 42 years, is it? Somewhere along those lines. The amount that has been accomplished with the offset programs is astonishing. I think from a realistic standpoint, though, the results, frankly, are mixed, both on a macro level and a micro level. And I think they've been a lot of successes at the beginning were more indirect investments. Now that both countries are moving toward a desire for more direct investment, it's getting harder. And part of that reason is that there does seem to be a lack of coherence on both nations. A lot of the criticisms that you can make regarding lack of strategy and lack of integration of strategies for both the UAE and the Saudis, frankly, let's be frank, a lot of those arguments could be made for the United States. I'm not aware of our economic and trade and security and defense policies being adequately tied to what our vendors are trying to do. If that were the case, we wouldn't be talking for several years about an export, trade, and licensing policy that is opaque, even under the best of circumstances, and probably not serving either our defense industrial base or the jobs and our export policies particularly well. They seem rather disconnected. So I think there's a lot to be shared from both sides of the transaction or from the relationships, both from a government and a private sector view. We've got a lot more in common than I think we admit to. I think that the big issue for offsets is getting the balance right between four players. And I think a lot of people miss that there really are four key stakeholders. The first is the originator's home government, in our case, the United States. And what are the United States' priorities? Pretty much jobs, export, and let's be frank, protecting our IP. No one wants to get caught selling the gold gem over for national security purposes or for military purposes, and they also don't want to create a competitor. Let's be very open about that. Then you have a very different standpoint from the host government. The host government's looking for employment, capacity building, and capability from an industrial base standpoint. Some of those dovetail, and some of them are in tension with each other. From a contractor shareholder perspective, you've got the bottom line, quarterly reports. Most of them are publicly owned. I've got to keep my shareholder happy by showing money, and I've got to show growth. And the growth means sustainment. And one of the probably the biggest problems with the outcome of many of the case-by-case offset projects is they're difficult to sustain, and they're difficult to sustain from a profitability standpoint. which has implications not only for the bottom line, but for the agreements that are made. And then you've got the armed forces on both sides, which have a slightly different agenda. One side is looking to make sure things are interoperable, maybe fill gaps, maybe deter. The other side may be looking to build capability. And actually, those two have much more in common, but that, again, is intention. I can't tell you how many times I sat in the assistant secretary chair, and I would hear about industry wants to sell XYZ PDQ, and I would go, oh my goodness, they're so far out ahead of us that I don't know if I can ever catch up. And that puts a tremendous stress on the system, and one with which we don't have a strategy, we don't deal with particularly well, and defaults into a struggle over licensing and export. There are a lot of core challenges. There are a lot of recommendations that I think the paper brings up, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you both. I want to start, Mary Beth, let me start with you, even though I've got a bunch of questions for Bilal as the author. Well, offsets are a key part of this business. There's been an explosion of offsets. Everybody has gotten good at working offsets. But also, some have gone horrifyingly wrong. Shrimp farms in Raytheon comes to mind. I'm not picking on Raytheon, so from anybody in Raytheon's standpoint, I'm not trying to find a sore wound and put a stick in it. That having been said, what would you rank as sort of, some of these packages, offset and otherwise, that have ended up being very beneficial for both parties, and which ones are sort of cautionary tales of avoidance and, oh dear God, let's not do that again? In so much as you can discuss this as somebody who,
one would hesitate to rank them. I think we all have heard, particularly early on when the offsets programs in both countries were being developed, I think there was probably a lack of centralized planning. So it would depend on the individual or the entity you were dealing with, whether someone had a pet rock, frankly, whether it was fish farming or whatever the example might be. In some cases, it would be, I want to use a local vendor for aspects of the program that were incapable of supporting the larger capability that was being developed, or perhaps were just inadequate to begin with. I'm sure that the motives were to provide more work for local vendors, but integration is always an issue. There's the famous example of the vehicle that had, I think it was an air conditioning or a transmission installed and it never worked again. There's a couple of examples sitting now in both the UAE and Saudi Arabia that probably aren't going to make the Hall of Fame as far as money well spent. ISR and UAVs is the new deep hole in which people are pouring money with not a lot of results. I think part of the reason that the Saudi Arabia economic offset program and the reiterations of the Tawazun Economic Council were developed was to try to streamline and shape those down to the committee level in Tawazun and get those more on track and more directly applicable defense and security. I think some of the ones that have worked well are Abu Dhabi shipbuilding. Back in the day, I think it was particularly worked well. The UAE's that was one of their first public offerings. They've had a number. I think they're about at 40 JVs right now. The Nimr, some of you are familiar, has even actually resulted in UAE exports. I think they would identify that as a success story. Those are two that jump off. AMROC, I think is a success story for a number of reasons. It's still nascent from a business standpoint. Maybe a little less successful, but it is, again, a work in progress. I think part of it depends, what do you determine success? Is it profitability? Is it sustainment? Is it actually providing a capability? Is it doing the mentoring and the human capital building that really needs to be done in both countries? So are you laying the groundwork for something later on?
Al Salam, for example.
Al Salam is a great example in the KSA. The AWACS is a terrible example of something that ran afoul and was not able to be sustained and probably fell apart. So there's a number. It's very mixed. I think the bigger problem is we do tend to look at them on a case-by-case basis. Let's look at this program. Let's look at this activity. Let's look at this project. And one of the reasons why I think they're vulnerable and fail is There's no larger picture, particularly to provide the enablers. So each project suffers from similar problems. Lack of human capital, lack of experienced managers, lack of technicians, lack of trained engineers, lack of business management experience to get in there and run the thing and sustain it. That's an endemic problem that dealing with each of these on a case-by-case basis, I think, exacerbates. Because then you have the same people competing for a very limited pool of enablers.
Right, but each one of these things, right, is supposed to have a drafting effect, right? You build an al-Salam, each one of these things becomes
Right.
more successful. They then feed a need for more engineers. They're, you know,
Right.
each one of the, Bilal's got a lot of fascinating statistics about how the education systems in each of the countries have dramatically evolved. Bilal, let me ask you, you know, sort of fundamentally, these are two countries that are vastly different in size, they're vastly different in history, they're vastly different in culture, they're vastly different in approach. Walk us through a little bit about, you know, what's the difference between how, you know, the Saudis are going about achieving their aim and how the Emiratis are going about achieving their aim?
Well, I think it all starts with vision and the business model and the type of investment that they've actually had in defense industrialization. I think it's just larger and clearer in the UAE. And I think also the approach in the UAE is much more flexible and cosmopolitan than the Saudi. But Saudi Arabia really has an enormous advantage in human resources, which is quite tragic because it's still a very untapped potential.
20 million
20
people.
million people in Saudi Arabia, locals. You got a little less than 1 million Emiratis in the UAE. How do you take advantage of that? I mean, what do you call them? Structural obstacles in Saudi Arabia? Why do you have so many people unemployed? Why this youth bulge in Saudi Arabia? They can't find a job. Why are they not part of this? The Emiratis are much more part of this. It's about vision. It's about the leadership. I think the leadership just gets it in the UAE. They're much more in tune with global trends and technology and in science. The Saudis have, I mean, gosh, what were they 20 years ago and where they are now? I mean, obviously massive investments in industry, and they're building industrial zones and cities, and you mentioned education, massive improvements. But it's just that involving their own citizenry. It's just that as simple as that. Nobody's saying that the Emirates is a democratic country, but they do a better job of involving their own people in the political process and in business and in economics. It's just not the same in Saudi Arabia.
Is it in part because the UAE is such a powerful banking center that there has been a greater, you know, or is it fundamentally that they're Emiratis and they bring sort of a moderate, more trade-oriented approach that's grounded in sort of centuries of history as sort of a crossroads?
You know, one of the major reservations I have in the report that people say why the UAE and Saudi Arabia are not where they should be is because of cultural reasons. I really feel that cultural determinism is just not helpful. But does culture have a say in this? Probably, and I'll leave it to social scientists for that to really give you a much more precise answer. But like I said, the approach of the Emiratis has been much more cosmopolitan. Why haven't the Saudis replicated that? I have no idea. Does it have to do with the religious system? Perhaps. But you see all sorts of people doing business in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi. Not the same in Saudi Arabia.
Right. Mary Beth, let me ask you one question about sort of being somebody who sat in the Pentagon and did policy in this part of the world. The countries are looking for greater independence, or from us, from an armaments standpoint, or from other countries, or greater independence just on their own. What happens when that greater independence is being applied in places like, for example, Syria and elsewhere, where the United States and other powers can't exactly pull their export control chits to sort of govern the flow? I mean, what happens then, and how does Washington respond to that?
Well, I think it gets to the broader issue that the report talks about internal to those countries, but it's also an issue internal to ours, is how much do you want your defense industrial base and the desire to grow and export there to be interoperable with your trade and economic policy, the idea you need to maintain exports, particularly in this sector, because they're big dollars and it's a huge job provider, versus policy tools, of which there are many, one of which is how much you export FMF, FMS, and direct commercial sales. And I'm not sure that we have an overarching policy, and that at times we struggle with using it. In some cases, Egypt comes to mind, or not using it in others. Do you want to punish the Saudis or the Qataris for proxy wars or activisms that we don't agree with from a policy standpoint in other countries by using this one policy tool? And what are the risks, not only internally to the US, but in your longer strategic relationships, interoperability, and defense and security of using that tool, and exacerbating the idea that you are unreliable as a partner, which sends them to other vendors in other countries that may be more reliable, or that you are self-interested to the point that you would sacrifice their own security by pulling your defense industrialization military/support. So, it's a balance. I'm not sure that we can be a little schizophrenic. And unfortunately, because of the way our bureaucracy works, most people would say that it adjusts and changes at least every 4 years, and sometimes more rapidly. So it makes us, while we talk a lot about lack of transparency and predictability from someone that we're selling standpoint, some would argue that no, the decision makers, King Abdullah, from a procurement standpoint, ultimately, the Crown Prince and the UAE are much more stable and predictable than the whims of Washington, the Hill, and our various institutionalized bureaucracies. So, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Well, I mean, some of the the Bush administration's policies drove some of our European allies to look at ITAR-free equipment, because they were like, all right, you know what, you're saying no to us is such that we're going to try to find, a different row.
Agree.
Very, very quick point on independence, and I really emphasize that we really are talking in relative terms here, not in absolutes. But what would they do with such independence? I just want it. Okay, I don't know what they would do with it, but I want greater autonomy in my foreign policy. I don't want to take part in international coalitions. I want to see my military fly over Libyan airspace just like the Emirati ones did. When I go to NATO and I tell them I want to strengthen my partnership with you, and NATO asks me, what do you bring to the table? I want to have a good answer. It doesn't have to be all bad. It's just every country aspires to have greater autonomy in its foreign policy. And right now, they just have very little of it, and they're very frustrated about it. More so the Saudis than the Emiratis. I think the Emiratis are much more comfortable working with US-led international coalitions. And I think that their military, to be perfectly honest, is much more capable than the Saudi military and more combat ready. But their leaders are less interested in actually swimming against the current and going outside the confines of the US-Emirati partnership than the Saudis. The Saudis, they have the willingness to be much more independent, but their capabilities are just in the way. And we shouldn't be surprised why they did a massive tour in Asia, touring that part of the world and signing MOUs with the Japanese, the Chinese, the Malaysians, the Indonesians, and others, some of them defense-related. Let's not confuse them with defense pacts. But they're serious about not putting all their eggs in one basket. We were talking about that earlier. Is there really a reliable alternative to the United States? I think Mary Beth and I disagree. I think that there isn't. But that doesn't mean that you don't explore other options. And who knows what happens down the road. Maybe the Chinese will be actually a go-to option as far as defense acquisition. But for now,
they bought long-range missiles from them.
Right, which they've been keeping in the basement since '87, and only recently they've showed them to the world. But yes, that's a good point.
Speaking about something they haven't done since '87, so what about the military parade in Saudi Arabia? What does that mean? Does it mean anything?
We also disagree.
It's a little bit Cold War, saw a parade of stuff, a little bit of criminology.
I'll just be very brief. I think it just reflects the insecurity in Riyadh, and it's no revelation really when I say that they're sending political messages to Washington. Everybody knows that they are sending, but the question is exactly what you're raising. What does that mean, and what?
They've been so subtle, though, these messages sometimes.
Right, I mean, it's just, you have the Pakistani leadership and the Emirati leadership sitting next to you. You're showing those Chinese missiles. Do you want to also send messages to Tehran? Probably. Are the Iranians threatened by that? I don't think so. Is Washington really going to sleep worse because of this? I don't think so either. I think Mary Beth disagrees with me on that. But it's just a reflection of their frustration, insecurity. I don't understand where this insecurity comes from. They're in a much better position than they think they are, but they're very vulnerable right now. And this whole parade basically just tells me that.
Do you disagree with any of that?
Yes.
Well, in that case,
You know, a parade is a parade. I think that if to the extent that we
well, I mean, a parade's a parade if you've got little pinwheels and sparklers, right? But I mean, it's a little bit different if you've got like heavy iron parading down the street, maybe.
well, military parades are not something are an exception either in the Middle East or elsewhere. So, and we used to have military parades, but I think we're missing a little bit the point, although Bilal danced around it just a little bit, because I'm sure that our pre-discussion convinced him that I'm partially right, so now he's hedging his bets. Sorry, I'm just joking. You know, I think it was a strategic communications opportunity. That's what that was. They dug out the Chinese missiles, which they have been sitting around wherever, and put them on display for the first time that anyone's aware of that I know, because they were using the parade to communicate messaging. And the messaging, I think, was to various people. The messaging was to each other by the strategic placement of the Crown Prince and the senior Pakistani military individual right there front and center with the kingdom. The message was, so we're united in this. The message was...
Pakistan has nuclear weapons I paid for, and these missiles can carry them.
Oh, by the way, I've got alternate sources for important things, and those of you who may be weaponizing from a nuclear standpoint, we all know that, by the way, from a Shia standpoint, we all know where the closest Sunni is, and oh, by the way, his contact is sitting 2 people over. I mean, there's certainly not news to anyone that there's certainly allegations or smoke and fire of certainly contacts between some of the Pakistani Khan, for example, with Saudi Arabia, et cetera, and speculation there. So I think that was a message to Iran and others. I think it was a message to the West. Oh, by the way, we're not done with this demonstration, that we're serious and that we're powerful and we have capability. And by the way, the Chinese who are in serious discussions, or if not have closed the deal with the Turks, we're happy to put their missile out because, oh, by the way, you limit us, not just the European that are looking for ITAR-free and COTS and other capabilities that are not restricted by what they believe and perceive to be somewhat difficult to understand U.S. policy. So I think it was a strategic communications messaging opportunity, no less.
Please.
I really like it when the pastor at the end of his sermon says, so what? What difference does the sermon make in your life? Same thing here. So what? Strategic communications, messaging, but what does that really mean as far as impact on policy? This is, I think, where we have an honest disagreement.
And with that, let me open the questions to the floor to see whether or not we can plumb other areas of disagreement. No, I'm joking. Questions for the floor, because I do have lots of questions and I can bore you guys all day with them. But do you guys have questions? Yes, sir. You get the award for first hand up.
Thank you.
Oh, and yes, and please identify who you are when you ask the question.
I'm Alan Kieswetter with Dentons. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the cooperation between Saudi and the UAE and among the GCC states generally.
Defense cooperation, or in this particular field and subject?
In this particular field that I know about the defense
cooperation. One of the recommendations I raise in the report that, and Mary Beth touched on it as well, is that ideally you'd like to see GCC-wide cooperation on this, but let's just limit it at least to Saudi and Emirati, because there's a lot of room for cooperation and collaboration, whether you develop a joint MRO base or anything of the sort. Right now, to my own knowledge, and I could be wrong, there's not a whole lot of cooperation happening. And this is really a tragedy because they share a lot of things in common. They can complement each other. And this would be hugely beneficial economically, and it would reduce a lot of the inefficiencies of both processes. But for reasons I just don't know, they simply have not found a way to better cooperate on this. But I suspect that down the road, and seeing greater alignment today in concerns, policies, who knows? Maybe this will materialize in the foreseeable future in cooperation on the defense industrialization. But right now, it's either non-existent or extremely limited, which is why I may have missed it.
I'm not aware of any. I think the hurdles to policy are great. I think a hurdle to an overall strategy to cooperate in particular areas are even greater. I think your best chance to get cooperation, and I'm not sure, frankly, that it would even work, would be on a case-by-case basis, where you had a hub-and-spoke arrangement so that you weren't requiring the two to cooperate bilaterally, that you had either a third-party nation, like we've attempted to do in the larger capacity building, or you had a vendor that was a multinational that said, that was able to persuade, it would be a tough sell. Components or activities from the UAE and the Saudis will come together with this whole, and somehow both of you will benefit. But I think from a business standpoint, that has its own challenges.
There's one promising example of cooperation, however, within the UAE, and it actually happened very recently. It's quite an interesting story. The three major strategic investment arms that are involved in this process, so Tawazun, Mubadala, and what is the other one? Emirates Investment?
EAI.
So they just joined all together to consolidate their MRO base and basically create synergy. And I was a little bit surprised because I thought there was intense competition between the two and the third one. But they were rational enough to realize that the opportunity to do that was just massive. So I'd like to see that happening with the Saudis now instead of just within the UAE.
Vester.
Hi, my name is Alejandro Sanchez. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. My question is about naval technology. For the past month, we have heard rumors that the Saudis and the UAE want to buy German submarines, Type 209, if I'm not mistaken, for a $3.4 billion deal. I'm just wondering how much of when you talk about priorities within the armed forces of each of these countries, how influential is the Navy, the Saudi Navy and the UAE Navy, and how developed are the military industries when it comes to these two countries? You talked about that these two countries are building, constructing ammo and drones. How about vessels?
Right.
Thank you.
It's a great question. I think the priority has always been, at least as far as the Emiratis, is the Air Force, and they've done a fantastic job with that. We were just joking about it earlier, although it's actually a fact that the UAE actually has better F-16s than the U.S. Air Force.
It's really not that funny, actually, if you think about it. But
the navies in both countries are nowhere where they should be. The Saudis are working very closely with the French. They're very impressed by naval technology that the French have provided them. And there's a large offset program talking about offsets, which is called Sawari. With the French, it's pretty old. But if you really want to talk very seriously about combat readiness and whether there will be any military conflict with the Iranians in that part of the world, it's nowhere near ready. And there's massive challenges, basically. We talk about shipbuilding in the UAE and what ADSB is doing, but a lot of it it's got great deficiencies. And I'm a big fan of the flagship program in the UAE and the Ghanata, but it needs at least another 5 to 10 years, basically, to at least match what the Iranians are trying to do and what kind of strategies the Iranians are using in the Strait of Hormuz and other places. The Army is a different story, by the way.
hang on, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so finish that story.
Well, it just goes back to human resources. I think, what was it, last year or earlier this year that the UAE has finally come up with a law where young Emiratis can actually join the army. That's a positive sign. But the Saudis is just a different story. And that's the Achilles heel, basically, of this entire process, the human capital and the human resources and the lack of local expertise. The Army is getting, obviously, a lot of training from the United States, but the emphasis has always been on the Air Force for the right strategic reasons, but you just cannot have such a massive imbalance between these three branches, and you gotta have greater integration. I mean, it's almost like the Navy and the Army and the Air Force are like just three completely different branches that don't even talk to each other. And that has massive implications for warfare and strategy.
Oh, the impatience of youth. So I am gonna put down some markers. I thought you were just describing the United States military pre-jointness, and the fact that we had existed for 100 plus years and hadn't figured that out. Here is, at least in the Emirates case, a country that's been existing less than half a century, and in the Saudis' case, post World War II, that we're impatiently saying they haven't figured out, joint, joint, joint all the way every day. And if you've been inside the building, joint is a very flexible term. So while I agree, I think that we need to moderate our expectations just a little bit. And I also worry about saying, and I know that part of this is youth and part of this we agree implicitly, but let me say it explicitly, nowhere where they should be. There's an awful lot of much more mature nations, even those within NATO, even programs within our own country that are nowhere that they should be. And I think statements like that are tough to defend when you look at what has been achieved by both countries in a relatively short period of time, not only from a raw capability standpoint, but from a defense industrialization standpoint, to move really within, in most cases, less than 20 years from scratch to exporters and world players on many counts. That's pretty admirable. Is it as far as one would want one to go? No. Is it as far as of giving them strategic independence or self-sufficiently? No. But you can give a whole list of countries worldwide, many of which are much more capable and respected in the defense field, that would fall into that category. But to answer your question, sorry, on the Navy, I think traditionally the Navy has suffered from lack of investment, both from a human capital standpoint, but from a monetary standpoint in both countries. Arguably, everybody's aware. Saudi Arabia has its Eastern Fleet. It has a certain amount of it that's French sort of designed and procured. Certain amount of it that's U.S. Certainly, there are no obligations for the countries to stick with that. I think there has been a lack of attention due to strategic investment and other reasons. I think that our concept of navies is very different. The need for a brown water navy or a combination brown water, blue water navy, one that performs roles that are much more similar to what we would view as a Coast Guard, a littoral capability, are very different from the U.S. perspective than it is from those perspectives. And the deep water capabilities such as submarines, which they may be looking at from the Germans, is definitely a blue water capability that heretofore hasn't been pursued with, there's no, with the rigor in which they have pursued, for example, air capability. But part of that goes to, a defense in-depth threat strategy where air pushed out their defensive parameters much easier than a maritime capability had, from my point of view. So are they going to buy submarines from the Germans? I don't know. I would hope they would buy American. That's, but I don't have a particular
We have to
insight.
get in the commercial diesel-electric powered submarine game, and as far as I know, the nuclear Navy the Navy leadership's never going to go with that.
Yeah, it's not for sale.
Open that grisly alternative. But look, one point that I would say in terms of moderating this is, if you have that much investment capital you can devote to any problem, you can solve it. And they've had a massive amount of investment capital to dole around to each one of the, not only to their citizenry, but also to advance education and to advance all of these different mechanical pieces of it.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes,
to throw out a real quick figure.
Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry.
No, throw out the figure.
But I just want to lay down a figure for everybody to think about. Depending on whether you talk to Avocent or you talk to A.T. Kearney or whatever, just the defense offset pool alone for Saudi Arabia is somewhere in the order of magnitude, and this isn't their money per se, this is other people's money that's their money, is $91 billion, somewhere between $91 billion and $120 billion at any particular point in time. if you had that much money to throw at a problem, think of what you could do. So I just wanted to highlight
Yes,
that.
I was coveting that amount of money as being, I'm not coveting, but it's an interesting amount of money. And so the question is, when you are starting it from scratch, you would try to not make the same mistakes that we made over time. So ideally, you're trying to build it in a way that avoids getting into these pitfalls. And unfortunately, a senior level conversation is sort of like, well, no, that's their piece of it. This is my piece. That's their piece of it. So, other question? Yes, sir.
Patrick Garvey with Triple Canopy. Thanks for the presentation. I just take it back a bit. I think if we're looking at this from U.S. defense industry, do we have anything to worry about competition-wise from either of these two countries in their industrial bases? And just glancing through your report, Bilal, I don't see anything. Not from the education sense, not from the the human capacity sort of sense. It's going to be some time, and I'd like you to discuss that. Thanks.
Bilal?
Why you should be worried? I don't think you have any reason to worry about that.
Okay.
I mean, at the end of the day, the key word here is partnership. I mean, they understand very well that without these offset programs, none of this would have been possible. This is the key enabling factor behind this whole thing. I mean, you can have national leadership, you can have vision, you can have all sorts of ideas about how you want to move forward with this, but without partnership with these top defense companies, none of this would have been possible. And I'm not just talking about arms manufacturing. I'm talking about academic institutions. I'm talking about centers of excellence. I'm talking about training. I'm talking about a lot of areas where there is partnership and there's collaboration. I'm not sure that there's a threat, as a matter of fact, as you very well know, within the next, for the next 20 years, the only way to do business as far as defense is going to be in the Middle East, and precisely these two countries, which will be spending on defense more than any other. Are we talking 30 years from now where they will be able to develop greater indigenous capabilities and diversify their portfolios and rely more on their own people and perhaps look at other sources? That's certainly possible, but they understand that U.S. technology is still the best, and that that's their choice. That's the number one choice, basically.
I think they'd very much like to be competitors in the future. I'm not sure that I can think of any particular. I mean, the NIMR competes with various. There are probably isolated products. I can't think of any services. I think so yes, eventually, not now, at least from a strategic standpoint. I think the bigger threat is that we miss the boat and we don't invest and we don't partner in meaningful ways and we don't fill gaps and others do, or we end up not being able to secure U.S. jobs, R&D funding, export and trade relationships with that region, and they either get they seek alternatives, although we have a disagreement as to whether there really are alternatives out there, or that they decide to go in a different direction.
I mean, we're not really talking about large platforms here where there will be competition or you'll be threatened by it. I mean, we're talking small scale, high tech, and this is their own niche areas. There's a potential for them to actually achieve some sort of self-sufficiency, at least as far as the United Arab Emirates, in ammunition. And they really have penetrated the American market as far as that limited area. But certainly we're not talking about large platforms.
That was much more, I think, of a Turkish strategy to build up Turkish industrial base and then be able to, access this Middle Eastern market a lot more capably as an Islamic, leading Islamic nation with far greater material, human, and financial resources that Turkey can leverage.
Yep.
Although, can I nuance that? I mean,
Yes.
I'm not here to speak for any particular company or country, but I do think there are aspirations in at least one of the countries to be an exporter to the region in certain ways. I mean, is it Curaçao or Colaco who does the ammunition?
Curaçao.
I mean, Curaçao is, in fact, you mentioned it now that I think about it, is exporting ammunition to the U.S., for goodness sake. So and if you were sitting here and you were an ammo manufacturer, you'd say, heck yes, there's competition. So I think it depends.
Well, we were using so much small arms there for a while that there wasn't a small arms manufacturer on the planet that wasn't shipping ammunition to us, right? I mean, Brazil, a lot of people were because we were maxed out in our factories. Jim?
Thank you. Jim Hassett, Atlantic Council. Thanks. Oh, that's better. For either one of you, but I'll point out that this was something, Bilal, that you had written. It's your line, so I get to repeat it. Arabs don't do maintenance. That's not any longer the case, you were saying. I hadn't heard it put that way, but I understand the issue that there's been a lot of, over decades, a lot of folks going into the Middle East to provide that on a contract basis. Following up on your point, Patrick, that might be a case of competition. In other words, eventually you have to figure out how to compete. Your customer is going to compete with you when he figures out how to do things on his own. Have we noticed so far, is that something that's just starting, or is it to the point now where some of the bigger companies that have been in that market, BA Systems comes to mind, are seeing their top line suffer as a result?
That's a great point. And I should have mentioned MRO, which is where really they are investing and focusing on a lot. And we mentioned As-Salam, which is a very successful example of that. And they realized that they have very few limited areas where they can actually compete and make a difference, and MRO is definitely one of them. But we also mentioned the case of AWACS, and that was a disaster. So they're definitely building their capabilities. I think it's been since the late 1980s, if I'm not mistaken, where they've actually started realizing that this is something we can actually make a difference in, retrofitting aircraft and all that sort of stuff. So anything else you want to add to that?
No, I would just note that having sat and looked at the world from a government standpoint, the Middle East is not alone in suffering from lack of attention to maintenance. My only point.
Yes, some of our gunshot wounds, however, are self-inflicted, as opposed to, well, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, maybe there's our truth. Yes, Byron.
Mary Beth, you talked about alternatives. I wonder if both of you can just talk about China as a potential player in this market. The Turkish air defense competition, I think. China's been active in the Saudi UAV market. Where are they going to fit in, and what should we watch for?
I think we're at the point in time where U.S. industry is at a substantial advantage. When you go to most anywhere in the world, at least when I go to most anywhere in the world, we're still the gold standard in many cases. We still have a reputation for following through on maintenance, integration, and servicing of our products. We still have I think the unique position of, from a defense standpoint, of having benefited from the deployment and the use of our equipment, technologies, our integration in actual combat or in actual military deployments, which very few countries can say. So you're not getting a science project, and you're not paying for someone to develop something. This is something that is either a program of record or has been deployed or is building off of that. And there we have a significant edge. Where we don't have an edge is we tend to have invested tremendous time and taxpayer dollars in very big systems. We have a very mature military. And unfortunately, the Gulf is not alone in that, from a consumer standpoint, that's a lot to swallow. Not so much from a capacity standpoint or a monetary standpoint, but just the manpower, for example, or integrating it is a huge task. And we have a distinct reluctance, incapability. We're not used to downsizing it and pulling it apart and making it flexible for the consumer. Because we have our consumer. Our consumer is the Defense Department. And we still haven't backed away from the fact that he's going to be our consumer again. So we're not going to make telltale changes to programs and capabilities, particularly the most advanced ones. I mean, they are what they are. And what that does is leave a hole for middle companies or for new producers or for emerging defense industrialized countries to go in and fill that gap. I mean, you see it with Brazil and aviation, with some of their capabilities that are coming out. We're all familiar with, what's the name of the company? It's escaping me right now. Embraer. The Chinese and just about everybody who can figure out how to either re-engineer a Predator or something like it is, inundating the UAV or the unmanned systems arena. Now, do we have better capability? Absolutely. Has anybody figured out, and can anybody demonstrate how to integrate this thing and actually make it work? I don't know anybody other than the U.S., other than the Israelis. But there's competition there. From China, Russia is using what's happening in Crimea and the Ukraine to double down. They are swarming the Middle East and other markets saying, oh, by the way, you got a weak sister who talk about a pain in the butt to buy things from. Big Daddy up north, we've got something similar. It may not be as glitzy. It may not last 1,000 years, but 50 years is good enough. And there's that good enough range, frankly, that we're blooping over that I think a lot of the competitors who are out there positioning themselves, France and Britain and Italy are out there, Finmeccanica and other companies, you've all been there. Is it the best, and can we have something that's a lot better, that's better bang for your buck and a better investment? Yeah, but sometimes that's just not what the client is interested in. And FCPA and other hurdles that we face with some emerging defense exporting countries, put us at a disadvantage.
Darn those ethics rules.
So the one word you'll hear 10 to 20 times if you're sitting in a meeting between a Gulf military commander and his American counterpart is interoperability. I think they get it now at this point. You want to go to the Chinese, you can kiss goodbye to that concept if you start buying in larger quantities, and they do get it. You mentioned Turkey and whether they're interested in buying air defense systems from China. I don't know what that would do to the NATO membership as far as the Turks. I don't know how serious they are in this process. I don't know if they're hedging their bets. But last time I checked, it hasn't been confirmed, right? That they would be buying anything from the Chinese.
They're reopening the competition as a way to sort of edge away from it.
And they understand very well.
Is how it's perceived, but
they understand very well that it has implications as far as compatibility with NATO systems.
But Turkey's looking to export its own precision-guided missiles and rockets. I mean, they're moving out.
Yeah, I thought one of the most interesting things was last year during the Paris Air Show, where for the first time Håkan Buska, Saab's CEO, sort of noted that 5 years ago China wasn't a player, and now we're increasingly over the last 5 years are tripping constantly over Chinese, and Sweden is a different, is a first-run country in terms of the capability that it's bringing to the world market, and so when you're, the Israelis were the ones who first said, like, wow, we're showing up in the same kinds of places. So, there's, in my mind, and I've been saying this for a long time, there's no way that the Chinese don't move up the defense industrial food chain. If you're, they're benefiting from our technology, they're sending their guys to schools in the United States, aerodynamicists that are getting trained at Cambridge, there's just no way in the world that then that person doesn't go back home, work in a Honeywell factory for 5 years and not end up learning something that actually will, so, laughing at a Comac aircraft and making believe like it's Bibi Habibi doing it again is just kind of fundamentally, I think, missing the point. But that's just my editorial commentary on that. Yes, sir.
Reggie Robinson with BAE Systems, and I appreciate all the comments I've heard today, and I agree with so many of them, but I'd just like to pull on a couple of strings. First time, Ms. Long, you said U.S. advantage in the region, the gold standard, and people still like it. And then it was the leverage still. As you talk, as we look more international for sales with declining U.S. budgets, there's a lot of leverage that Saudi has, that the UAE has. So if we look at industrialization, not from the perspective of other internationals going in to try to sell into the market, or those countries developing a capability that would compete against U.S. companies in the future, but just in the immediate term, doing business in those two countries today, fundamentally different than just several years ago. Industrialization will grow because they will demand offsets, in-country reman, upgrades, production. Can you talk a little bit about that and going forward and how that changes the landscape for U.S. companies?
I think it's going to get harder, general, to compete with other countries that are more flexible as far as not only how they configure their offset or other requirements, but their flexibility as far as whether or not they're state-owned. I mean, China, I'm not aware of Chinese companies' requirements to report to their shareholders, which drives a certain business model that the U.S. basically does, but I'm suspecting that it gives them a substantial advantage from the get-go, and same could be said of many other countries. I actually have a slightly different view, and it's based on lack of information, which never has deterred me before, so why should it now? On the agreement between Mubadala, Tawazun, and EAI, and I think that's actually an interesting thing. I mean, to think that they were real competitors, yes, but I mean, as many of you know, IGG, et cetera, they all sort of owned parts of each other, and I think it's more of a consolidation of policy and apparatus where Mubadala in particular with the defense and aerospace portfolio was very much a leader. EAI had its more service-oriented, had its niche, and Tawazun also had its niche, but it's much more of a consolidation, I think, for a more strategic purpose, and that's a good thing. I do think that because the U.S. has a great reputation, and not to say that others don't, there is that opportunity that if we could align our business interests with a defense and trade and economic policy that enhanced our ability to actually get into real partnerships with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, where we are not only creating business centers that meet our shareholders' interests, but also the requirements of the host country, that we could do a lot more. I think we're just lagging a bit. And I'm not sure that our business models, without a little bit of help, either from relief from offsets or a more flexible approach to offsets, is going to be able to do it on its own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was very well said, and there's nothing I disagree with what you said. I mean, if there's anything I could add is, and the defense companies know that already, offsets are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. I know that they hate every bit and piece about it, and I've talked to a lot of your colleagues about what kind of concerns they had about the offset programs in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They just want them to be more flexible. They want them to be more adaptable to their own interests and needs, but they're here to stay, and they instead of getting frustrated about them, I think that the reasonable recommendation would be that to actually flesh out a strategy to better engage those programs, because they're not changing their minds about them. They're actually emphasizing their importance even more, and they're very serious about tech transfer, about training their own people, about putting them in positions of leadership in the entire process. So they're here to stay.
The good enough point, I think, is a very, very important point, especially as you look at the global marketplace, because at the end of the day, everybody's in a financial pinch, and everybody's realizing quantity has a quality all its own. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether or not, if your ships are the absolute best of class in the world, if you don't have enough of them. And that's a fundamental challenge, and for a lot of countries out there, good enough is good enough. So it's X quantum % better, or I have the same capability, but it costs me half as much to deliver that capability, that particular effect. Then, if you're the guy who's making sure that every single piece of this, not to use a Bob Gates term, but to use a Bob Gates term, is exquisite, you got a problem, because the only guys who can afford it are Saudi Arabia, UAE, and a handful of other countries around the world.
And can I add to that? And it's affordability, but where I see the rubber meeting the road even more is, our systems are designed with an almost inexhaustible workforce that's highly trained and capable in mind. I mean, I don't know, name the platform, but in addition to the people who are actually running it, you've got a tail of, in some cases, tens if not hundreds more. I sometimes, as the assistant secretary, saw vendors who were attempting to sell a system or a large program that it would take half of the employable military that they were trying to just man the thing. Just not realistic. And we try to shove it down their throat because we know they need it and it's the best of the best and it'll do magnificent things. It'll wash your clothes and hang it if you want. But the fact of the matter is, even if the host country is reluctant to go, good enough, the fact of the matter is our systems are just too big and cumbersome, which gets to a bigger point, which is at what point do we change our production and our sales and incentivize companies who are spending a tremendous amount on R&D and putting themselves out there for big programs that don't have an export option in mind from the get-go. And so then later on, you get stuck with something that you can't export either for licensing or because it's just too darn big and cumbersome, and we have missed the opportunity to design something that's either components or whatever and don't have an export version, which not only harms the business, but I think harms our national security interests.
Absolutely. Bilal?
So this drive toward localization and training their own people and putting them in positions of authority. I mean, the U.S. companies just get it. It's very smart. That's the main driver behind these offset programs. But the problem is, and the challenge that the U.S. companies are facing is that there just simply aren't enough local managers. There aren't enough local experts. And there aren't enough local people who can manufacture and all that, who understand actually the business of this whole thing. And even those who are available, those U.S. companies would say, they're just not fit for the job. And that's the challenge they face, is that we understand what you're trying to do, but you're just not there yet, and you're actually being very aggressive about it.
Yes, sir.
Richard LeBaron from the council. Just a question.
Sir, would you like a mic?
A quick question about two big players in the region, Iran and Israel. Maybe I've missed something, but it seems like the definition of maintaining the qualitative edge for the Israelis has somewhat changed or shifted because of our relationship with places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the way that defense relationship has expanded. And secondly, with the Iranians, would you expect, if the Iranians do come in from the cold, is that, and along with the Saudi need to address domestic concerns, would you expect a decrease in defense spending in the kingdom?
So Mary Beth is in a unique position to talk in greater detail about QME, since I'm sure she dealt with it when she was in the government. But obviously it's a major factor when it comes to U.S. Concerns about releasing more technology to its Gulf partners. To what extent is it still relevant in today's strategic environment? In my opinion, not so much, especially when you factor in the coziness of relations between some Gulf countries and the Israelis behind closed doors. Should that change? Absolutely. But I think it's a very solid rule in the U.S. government that really has not gotten enough resistance from whether from within or actually the Gulf partners basically challenging the U.S. administration to, why don't you just revise that, because it's really becoming less and less relevant. But Mary Beth, I'm sure, knows much more about that. As far as the Iranians, I'm sorry, I forgot the question. What was the question?
Iran goes away, and then all of a sudden everybody goes, whoopee, and I save money. And I don't have to do all of this stuff.
I'll defer to Mary Beth. That's why I have her here, the difficult questions. I'll just defer to her.
I probably have a controversial view about both, and I'll preface that. QME, in my experience, and I can only speak to my experiences, is probably less a formula and more of an art form. And I think it's applied differently depending on what is the particular interests of not only the U.S. government, but the Israeli government, which is sometimes slightly disconnected from their industrial base. And it depends a bit on situationally. For example, I think Israeli would find an argument regarding qualitative military edge to be very different when they're speaking about air capabilities, for example, with the UAE, than they would perhaps a Saudi. And don't forget that there are not only national capabilities that are considered, but there is the rogue agent or the fact that it's proliferated, which again may be a slightly different calculation for those two countries. And I think what that results in is a public impression that QME shifts around a little bit. And I think it does to a certain extent. I also think US-centric ideas that are much more black and white of what QME does or is in a particular situation sometimes can be manipulated. And sometimes I think QME, frankly, works out to be both a sword and a shield, depending on how one intends to use it. And I'll leave it at that. I found it an intriguing concept to deal with. That said, I do think there is, interestingly, I think the press is right that there's a perhaps unique period in time now when, despite QME, which gets to Bilal's point, there is probably an unprecedented dialogues, both official and unofficial, among and between the Gulf states and Israel, where they have shared interests. And those interests are, of course, they're concerned about Iran. And some of them are shared interests that go to military, industrial-based type issues. Getting down the brass tacks, business is business is business, and you can overlook a lot of things when both businesses benefit and it's not a strategic threat. So I think that also makes QME seem to fluctuate depending on what's going on. As far as Iran is concerned, my view is that, and again, I wouldn't speak for any of those countries, I would expect both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, if Iran comes out from the cold, to hedge their bets. And while overtly welcoming and in fact engaging and continuing to engage in initiatives politically and others, that there'll be increased spending, or certainly the same. It may be a different type of spending, definitely more advanced efforts on cybersecurity, technical security, infrastructure protection, redundancies on transportation and key logistics and others. I think certainly the Saudis will, they've said they intend to procure their own nuclear capability. There will be a lot of spending that is ancillary and direct as relates to that. I mean, both of them will tell you, even coming in from the cold, to enable Iran to have its missile defense and other capabilities, which we tend to gloss over, the asymmetric warfare that they're suffering from, the involvement in internal political, the other bad acts, won't decrease with an empowered Iran. Those will increase with an empowered Iran, both domestically and regionally, and I think you'll see a lot of spending and angst there.
So just 2 quick points on Iran. Going back to prestige and regional status affirmation, right? I think that the Saudis and the Emiratis look at Iran and what they have been able to produce locally, whether it's UAVs or missiles. And not only do they want to match that, but they actually want to surpass it. And I absolutely agree with Mary Beth that defense spending will continue to rise regardless what scenario happened with the Iranians. And this is something I just mentioned yesterday at NDU. I'm not sure which scenario is worse for the Gulfies as far as whether the Iran reaches an agreement with the P5+1 or it actually acquires a nuclear weapon. You would think that the latter is worse, but the other one also demands that you maintain such a strong military posture as well to try to counter what we call Iranian malign influence, which is not going to go anywhere, right? The bomb is one thing, but Iranian influence in the region has to be countered and deterred by stronger defensive capabilities, which is why defense spending will not go anywhere and will continue to rise.
I'm not as sure as I'm convinced that it doesn't go anywhere. History is full of examples where a threat changes, strategic threat changes, and that drives a reduction in spending, period. Yes, Iran is not going to become a good guy that you're going to bear hug. Guys in the administration and even senior military leaders in the region will say that. That said, it changes, right? That nature of that threat would change. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, this is also imposing a huge tax on the Iranian economy. And one of the reasons the Iranians are moving in this direction is, we can become an economic heavyweight in the region if we're just not regarded as the guy who's an incessant problem. And at the Manama dialogue, which I thought was very interesting, during an exchange, and I can't remember now who the exchange was between, but was effectively one of the regional leaders saying, like, look, you got to stick. I think it was Bahrain.
It was Bahrain.
It was
Prince,
Bahrain.
yeah.
And he was basically saying, like, look, you guys are like putting a stick to me in every way to destabilize my country. You're using like the global radio and television system that you guys have to sow unrest. And like the next day, there was like a formal apology that went out of, we're going to back off and we're going to give you room and I apologize for it. And apparently it was like broadcast around the world. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that one isolated instance, marks a massive change, but I'm just saying that I think that there are pressures that are driving it, and so the notion that everybody's just going to go ahead and spend the same, they may aggregate spend the same amount of money for a while until it's proven that the guy's not an enemy. But if you look at how France and Germany spend differently because they know that the Rhine is, no longer a semi-permeable barrier that could be violated by somebody, at the drop of a hat. So, yes, sir.
Hi, Mike Ellerman from the IISS. Regarding the question about Iran, I think it depends on how they come out. There's various levels. If there's a nuclear agreement, what does that mean? Does it go, much further? And I think there's a range of variables that could be achieved there. My question has to do with how are the Emiratis and the Saudis prioritizing their view of where they want to invest in defense industries? Is there a formal prioritization, or is it more of an ad hoc, business-based, find the seams and try to fill them?
Or my sheikh really likes this idea, and so that's why I should do it. I'm not trying to be discharitable to anyone.
Well, it seems to me that one of the areas that they would want to focus on is, say, systems engineering and integration. Those are key issues that are, they're not huge capital investments, except in, your people. And that skill can be transferred, almost seamlessly between defense industries and commercial industries. That's where I would invest my money.
Right.
And in fact, this is where Iran has really broken the model in terms of their own internal defense production capacity, is in the systems engineering and management capacity. They're very disciplined.
Right.
Whereas the Iraqis, the North Koreans are not. And it seems that's where they've achieved much greater success, and why they've achieved more success. So my question is this in the calculus of the leadership in the Emirates and in the Saudi?
Right.
Thank you.
Well, that's where China's achieved its success also, right? Its ability to be able to do big things.
Right. So two of the criticisms I've had regarding this entire process is that, and that's something that Mary Beth mentioned earlier, and it's in the report, I just want to see greater clarity and strategy with this. Why are you doing this? I understand there are economic benefits. I understand it down the road. It might address some of your national security concerns, but those expected benefits shouldn't really be the main drivers. I want to have some greater precision in this entire process. And I have yet to see, and maybe it's a document somewhere in the office of Mohammed bin Zayed, I don't know, but I want to see actual defense production policy. Maybe it exists, but I just haven't seen it. That would clarify a lot of things for me. What you decide to produce and what you decide to buy, I'd like to see greater linkage between the two. There's a lot of ad hoc stuff going on, and it's and this is something that Mary Beth also mentioned earlier. I want to see greater linkages between your offset programs and your industrial strategies. It's got to be integrated. But going back to systems integration, I think the Emiratis get it. I think they are very much involved in that under the umbrella of Tawazun and Mubadala. They've got a bunch of companies doing exactly that. Now, how successful are they? I'm not really in a position to judge, but they certainly understand that this is an investment that they want to pursue down the road. And are they doing it on their own? Definitely not. They're doing it with the top defense companies, partnership and joint ventures. But this is something that's certainly on the radar. To what extent are the Saudis capable of performing the same operations and functions as far as systems integration? I can't really tell. I'm not really an expert on that.
I think I agree with what you said. There are documents, and I can't remember the name of the strategies that I'm familiar with, and Bilal, you probably do, where the UAE articulates fairly broadly what the prioritizations are for
Is that the
offsets.
2030 strategy
It's the
document?
2030 strategy, and then there's as part of the offset reforms that came out a couple of years ago, and I know the answer sitting right there, but there are articulated general. Aerospace is certainly one. Integration is one. They're fairly broad. I don't know how the Tawazun Economic Council and the committee prioritizes specific projects. There's probably a good article or probably a good conversation. I just don't know. I do think the linkage is interesting and it's something that needs to be developed. Both countries are putting a tremendous amount of investment in exactly the area that you're discussing, engineering and technicians. The King Abdullah Science and Technology Center, there are 3 or 4 serious investments of time and resources in Saudi Arabia. I know I'm missing the name of several of them. And the UAE as well, with MIT and a number of universities. Yep. The issue then, though, becomes, and they're actually sort of similar problems, but opposite problems. In the UAE, you have just a much smaller workforce. So everyone's competing over whatever trained engineers or technicians that comes out, and there's just aren't enough. And plus that you have a mentoring and an experience gap that over time has got to be filled, but it's going to take time. With Saudi Arabia, you have a similar gap. You've got a lot of potential university students, 60% of whom are women, by the way, who are being educated in those fields, but then you have to be able to plug them into an existing industry and give them the experience, which is why many of you get the knock, 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 can we have an exchange, or are you willing to take 4 Saudi students or 16 Saudi interns or whatever, which presents problems for security and defense and other. But that's the idea of what they're looking for. You can't beat that experience of working side by side. So I do think there is a concept that really could be nurtured, particularly in the UAE. I don't know enough about Saudi priorities where you have taken it out of the IT experience. And I choose IT because you have a youth that is incredibly plugged in, even more plugged in than ours, and very comfortable dealing with computers and cutting edge technology, but almost a mentoring, incubating idea where as part of the offset process, you could actually incubate select individuals who will then be expected and incentivized to become the senior managers, the technicians, et cetera. I think that's sort of the idea. We're not quite there yet, but that would require the linkages that we're talking to again.
One of the key things to remember from a defense industrial standpoint is nobody is a defense industrial power without being an industrial power. That's right. So one of the challenges that all the countries are working on is actually to assemble all of those subordinate pieces. So this notion that purely by investing in your defense sector you will automatically, there's some automaticity between those two things is a fallacy. Right. We ended up being where we ended up because we had a surging industry that was able to be quickly converted to the arsenal of democracy, and then we've lived off of all of the sort of conjoined benefits of all of that, but it wasn't. That's the challenge people have is like, well, wait a minute, it actually illustrates, and what I think the report does well is sort of illustrate the challenges and the disconnects between, okay, I'm educating all these people, but where do I place them in the near term? And hence, that's why everybody's bugging defense contractors to say, like, can you please take some of our smart people for a little while and, groom them so that they can grow and basically beat you at your game. Right. It's a great proposition. With that, unless anybody has any more questions, I think it's time for us to wrap up. We'll be here and we can, take any other questions. Or obviously, I have the easiest job in this, and neither served in government nor had to write a report, and I still get to, get up here and participate in this. Closing comments from our speakers.
Well, I mean, it really bears repeating that this is a long-term process, obviously, as I mentioned in my conclusion. Why do I have higher expectations, Maribeth? Exactly what Vago was saying, because they have the capital. It's that simple. Nobody is in that position. They are in a unique position today to spend where others are scaling back and rolling out. It's just that simple. Will they, and I think I discussed a range of, 5 to 15 years. That's just because I just don't know. I mean, it's as wide a range. But they need to invest in the most critical variable, which is, at the end of the day, the human capital. And they understand it very well. It's going to take some time because there's just not as many people in the UAE. There are as many in Saudi Arabia, but you need to create jobs for them. It's just that simple. And you need to further institutionalize. I mean, this whole thing cannot happen in an institutional vacuum. The institutional capacity of both countries is just weak. And unless there are massive improvements in that area, the whole process could just really face a lot of challenges and even lose its sense of purpose. So with that, I understand that, you know, it's a lot to expect from them, but where they were, as we discussed, and where they are now, I think for all of the analysts that would be deeply skeptical about, you know, what they can achieve and what kind of reforms they have to implement, let's just not belittle what they've done so far. And I think that they have every reason to be confident about the future. They have to play their cards right because they have the capital for it, and no one else, literally no one else, is spending as much as they are.
First of all, I want to thank everyone again. I'm also very optimistic. I think both countries are going to make this happen. For me, the question is, how do you overcome the challenges, and what is having a bunch of industries that are actually producing things or providing services good enough? And what's the goal? Is it capable exports from the UAE? Is it a trained workforce in the short term where you develop skills? Is it being able to compete with the U.S. on certain issues and levels? I mean, I'm not sure. Depending on how you slice and dice it, I think it matters, and the timelines are very different. I do think it's going to happen, and the bigger issue is what role and what participation is U.S. private sector and the U.S. government going to play, and I think that's very much in play. And I think we have a couple of years to sort it out, and I'm optimistic that we'll get there, but I don't see a lot of movement in that direction. You know, ITAR reform is interesting, but it's not moving nearly at the pace, and it isn't nearly as comprehensive as it needs to be. And it needs to be embedded in our other concerns, which is jobs, maintaining our industrial base, really partnering, really enabling our export, and really incentivizing companies who are involved in this sector to make hard decisions that are not exactly on their dime, but will benefit both the country, the company, and our partnerships. I mean, we need some fundamental changes. But I really commend the Atlantic Council for the big thing, which is no one else that I'm aware of is talking about this. You know, we know a lot more about Italian or even Czech industrial bases militarily. They have a much less impact on where we're going and where we are from a defense business standpoint and from a security standpoint, yet we really don't know much about of these really key players. And there's a lot of lessons learned that we have that maybe the Singapore has. There's a Turkey, Korea. There's a lot of lessons learned that we could bring to bear, not only from a business standpoint, but from a policy standpoint. And now is the time to bring them to that region, both from, frankly, a profit perspective and a national security perspective.
And with that, thanks everybody for joining us for the conference, and especially for you guys who stayed until the absolute end. And I want to congratulate Bilal, and I think he makes a great add to the Atlantic Council staff to be able to, again, shed light on an issue that a lot of Washington doesn't pay attention to, even though it is a critical part of the business. Thanks very much, everybody. We appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, man.
Bilal.
Appreciate it.
Shukran.